control in Melbourne, in Australia, but also several cases related to the Hong Kong. So you can find easily, Google her name easily, and then you can find a lot of publications that you might get, yeah, with the topic on human trafficking, including the prostitution, yeah, women in the prostitution, and so on. So I'm very happy to have her here. Actually, 2 years ago, we were planning to invite Julie, but it was COVID, and now we can organize a meeting with her. And then, so I will happy to have her here, and I will hand over the sessions to Devita, Bu Devita, so Bu Devita can manage all the program. And then good luck for everybody, and then we will then close this formally the semester of the semester today. Yeah. Then thank you very much. Time is yours, Mbak Devita.
Okay, thank you very much, Bu Iyi. Just to open up the session, I would like to say good afternoon to everyone. I hope all of you are having a nice day. For those of you who knows me, I don't think I need to introduce you, but for those of you who doesn't, my name is Tata. I am a lecturer at the Criminal Law Department in the Faculty of Law, Universitas Gadjah Mada, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's guest lecture about the challenges of victim participation, victim protection for human trafficking. This theme is an urgent discourse to be discussed, especially taking into account Indonesia's context in connection with human trafficking. As a lot of you may know, Indonesia is known to be a country of origin, transit, and even destination for human trafficking, primarily because as a country, we continue to struggle with certain social issues. For example, poverty, poor education, employment opportunities, and cheap labor. And so these conditions are basically conducive to human trafficking because traffickers would typically attract victims under the pretext that they will give them better jobs with better salary, where in fact they end up being exploited and even vulnerable to other crimes, including sexually motivated crimes. Now, based on this background, our guest lecture today aims to discuss the many facets of human trafficking that poses different kinds of challenges that may hamper victim protection. We're going to discuss also what causes such challenges and how we can move forward to better guarantee effective victim protection. And so our guest lecturer today is Dr. Julie Ham. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology in the University of Hong Kong. Good afternoon, Dr. Julie Ham. We are so glad to have you here with us today. Dr. Ham is also a distinct expert in the field of sociology whose researches revolve around cross-cutting issues from gender, migration, trafficking, intersectionality, civil society, and also social justice. Dr. Ham has published an extensive line of journal articles along with books and also book chapters. Her recent researches concerns about migrants and domestic workers. So it's more than fitting and fortunate for us that we have her with us today. Before we begin, I would like to briefly explain about the technicalities. First of all, I highly encourage all of you to turn on your camera so that we could engage better with Dr. Ham and have a good interaction. Furthermore, in terms of the rundown, Dr. Ham, you have approximately 40 minutes to 1 hour to give your lecture, and that will be followed by a Q&A session for an allocated time of approximately 30 minutes. For the participants, if you have any questions in mind, you can address them to me by chat anytime during the lecture, or alternatively, if you want to directly engage with Dr. Ham, you could do so by raising your hand during the Q&A session, and I will call your names based on the order of hand raised, okay? Now, if you don't know where you could raise your hand on your Zoom screen here, you could, I think there's a button on the lower screen where it says reaction, and then there's a button that says raise hand. So you could do that if you want to ask questions, okay? Now, without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Ham, please. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you all today. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint. Oh. All right. Okay, so hopefully you'll be seeing a PowerPoint now. The title of my talk today is Challenges in Victim Protection in Anti-Trafficking. So I have amended it slightly from the title on the poster, and I'm hoping that this talk will make it very clear why I've chosen to retitle it in this way. And I'll explain as I go on. All right, so to start off with, I just want to provide a very brief definition of human trafficking. So what are we talking about when we talk about human trafficking? One advantage or one consensus is, or one strength of the human trafficking discourse or anti-trafficking discourse is that there is one internationally recognized definition, and that has been defined by the United Nations. Not everyone may agree with absolutely everything in the definition, but there is an international consensus on what we're talking about when we talk about human trafficking. And so, as the graphic shows here, the act of human trafficking includes three components. So these three components have to be present in order for something to be called human trafficking. So first of all, there is an act, which can include either the recruitment or the transport or harboring receipt of persons. So some sort of containment or control of persons. That's the act. Then we have the means. And so if this act happens through these particular means listed here, through threat, use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability, or giving payments or benefits. So the means do include actions that involve force of some kind. And then we have a purpose. So for the purpose of exploitation. So if there is recruitment or transport of persons through coercive or deceptive or violent means for the purposes of exploitation, we can call it human trafficking. And so it's important to remember, so when we break down the definition like this, we can see that human trafficking can occur in different industries. So it is not something that is limited or restricted to a particular industry or to a particular work sector. So that's important, very important to keep in mind. And this definition is outlined in the United Nations Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. This is often referred to as the Palermo Protocol or the UN Human Trafficking Protocol for convenience. All right, so that's what human trafficking is. Now, I wanted to do something I wanted to do something useful for the lecture by talking about issues that anti-trafficking stakeholders are discussing right now. So if you're interested in working on this topic, if you're interested in working on these issues beyond your studies, I wanted to give you information that would best equip you to engage in those debates. And when we're talking about human trafficking, one urgent conversation that has been going on for quite a while, and it continues to be urgent and it continues to be very important, is about taking a critical look at the anti-trafficking industry. So by definition, the anti-trafficking industry is there to supposedly help victims of human trafficking. If you want to stop human trafficking, then that, by definition, that means anti-trafficking. However, there is growing consensus and there is growing concern about the harms that are being produced by the anti-trafficking industry. And if we're talking about how to best protect victims of human trafficking, we have to take a close look at how the anti-trafficking industry may actually be endangering victims of human trafficking. And I'll hopefully explain in clear enough detail what that means. So to begin with, so when I'm explaining to students, how to think about human trafficking in relation to anti-trafficking, I find this image quite helpful in kind of thinking about these two spheres or these two areas. Oops. All right. So when you think of the term human trafficking, and I'm not sure, I'll be very interested to know if this is also the case in Indonesia, but for example, in Hong Kong or in Western countries, when you say the word human trafficking, the images that typically come to mind are similar to the ones shown here. So this is an image that you might see in a public awareness campaign in a Western country. So when you say the word human trafficking, some people envision people who are tied or contained. So you'll see imagery of chains, you'll see ropes, you'll see symbols that connote the sale of humans. That's the kind of imagery that that often comes to mind among the general public. However, if you talk directly to communities or groups that are directly affected by human trafficking, when you say the term anti-trafficking, you may actually, the image that comes up may be the one shown here. So hands in handcuffs. So still there is an imagery of containment, control, restriction, but the handcuffs suggest that control or restriction, containment by the state. And so that association between anti-trafficking and, for example, criminalization is something that is definitely felt by communities that are directly impacted by human trafficking and anti-trafficking. So I want to hopefully encourage you guys to think about this in more detail. And so when it comes to anti-trafficking, you will find that among particular communities, particular marginalized communities, you may often encounter strong negative reactions. So it does raise this question, is anti-trafficking a dirty word? And I think it's an interesting question to think about because supposedly or ideally, anti-trafficking should be helpful for victims of human trafficking. So we'll talk more about whether this is actually the case or not. So when we're thinking about how to protect victims of human trafficking, and if we're thinking about the ability of the anti-trafficking industry to protect victims of human trafficking, it's very important to look at the research of the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, or GATW. So in 2007, they published a very important report titled Collateral Damage, the Impact of Anti-Trafficking Measures on Human Rights Around the World. And so they definitely had a global overview, but they looked at 8 particular countries as case studies to see how the anti-trafficking industry was protecting victims, or how initiatives countering human trafficking were either succeeding or failing. So as you can see from the list of countries here, the Global Alliance definitely tried to capture a diversity of countries' experiences. So we have countries from most continents on this list. And so these countries are very, very diverse. So you may think, well, what does Australia have in common with Nigeria? What would Bosnia have in common with India? But despite the diversity of countries listed here, the overall global conclusion was unmistakable. It was very clear. And it was that anti-trafficking measures, particularly measures situated within a criminal justice framework, were actually endangering victims of human trafficking further. The researchers were also looking at the protection of rights, the protection of the rights of victims and human rights. And what they found was also very concerning. And so what they found was that the way anti-trafficking measures were being implemented was actually undermining human rights, women's rights, and migrant rights. So they were asking this question: are human rights considered collateral damage in the fight against human trafficking? And so I'm going to move on to explain a few things about why that is. The next, I do want to just give a heads up or a warning or note of caution. The next slide that I'm going to show does have quite disturbing imagery. It does have quite violent imagery. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But what I do want to say is that the images on the next slide all come from public awareness campaigns. So these are images that were deliberately developed, that were deliberately constructed to educate the public about human trafficking. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but I do want to show you some of the imagery and some of the examples on how the public is informed about human trafficking, particularly in Western countries. I believe these are all from Western countries, and also Eastern European countries. Okay, so moving on. All right, so whoops. Let me see. Okay, so one of the concerns that critical anti-trafficking scholars have, and that critical anti-trafficking stakeholders have, is that the representation of gender in public awareness campaigns is a barrier to assisting victims. So if the ultimate goal is to assist victims of human trafficking who have experienced force or deception or coercion, who have experienced exploitation, what you hear from anti-trafficking scholars and stakeholders is that our understanding of gender in anti-trafficking public awareness campaigns is not helping. It's producing further harm. And so, as listed here on the slide, critics do question the ethics, accuracy, and consequences of representations used in public awareness campaigns. And if you remember from the images on the slide, all of the images were of women, and women in quite vulnerable positions, in quite fearful positions. And so this definitely speaks to a strong concern about the anti-trafficking industry, that when stakeholders think about how to protect victims, that there is ultimately a greater focus on women's vulnerability rather than women's rights in migration and work. So the representation of human trafficking is very gendered. It tends to typically focus almost exclusively on women. The realities of human trafficking are much more diverse. The reality is that both women and men are trafficked. And there has actually been some very useful research on the trafficking of men from Indonesia. However, when we think about how human trafficking is communicated to the general public, there tends to be an exclusive focus on women. Not only that, but when the public hears about human trafficking, or when the public is educated about human trafficking, there is a much greater focus on the supposed weaknesses or vulnerabilities of women, rather than violations of women's rights in migration and work. And so when we're thinking about victim assistance, this is one question that you can keep in mind if you're working on victim assistance for human trafficking survivors. You can think about, the program that you're dealing with or the campaign that you're looking at. One question you can ask yourself is, does this focus more on vulnerability rather than rights? Is this rights-based, or is this vulnerability-based or weakness-based? There has been, considering the images that I just showed, there is definitely a strong concern that ultimately these images reaffirm patriarchal and imperialist ideas about women. These ideas that women are helpless, they're vulnerable, they're needing rescue, they're unable to speak for themselves. And given that a lot of these public awareness campaigns in Western countries, in European countries, in predominantly white countries, there can be this also imperialist discourse where it's about female victims from the third world needing rescue from developed countries. So there can be that problematic discourse underlying some of these campaigns. And in these images, there can be strong links between sexualization and victimization. So there are concerns about eroticizing violent imagery to try and package human trafficking issues for public consumption or public awareness. And so if you're interested in this topic, then one very useful article to start with, and one scholar to look into is Rudvica and Rajasevich. So this is a very useful article titled "Beautiful Dead Bodies: Gender, Migration, and Representation in Anti-Trafficking Campaigns." And what she argues, this article looked at public awareness materials from Eastern Europe. So how Eastern European women were depicted in anti-trafficking campaigns. So she argues, the display of suffering and beautiful victims positions the woman's body as the object of the male gaze and mobilizes erotic ways of looking that disclose a voyeuristic eroticization and fetishist fascination with a severed or captive female body. The representation of violence is thus itself violent, since it confirms stereotypes about Eastern European women as beautiful victims, equates the feminine with the passive object, severs the body from its materiality and from the historical context in which trafficking occurs. And so the concern is that these public awareness campaigns are one component, they're one thing that is fueling what has been called the rescue industry. So Laura Augustin has produced some very valuable, some very important research on this topic. So she coined the term the rescue industry to describe anti-trafficking programming or anti-trafficking services or initiatives that are supposedly meant to help victims, but may instead end up harming them further. So she describes the rescue industry as an ever larger social sector dedicated to helping and saving prostitutes, sex workers, fallen women. By defining women as victims, rescuers find their own identity and meaning in life. And so there is this disconnect between what Laura Augustin terms the rescue industry, that claims to provide assistance to victims, that claims to provide, to help victims escape abusive situations. And what we hear from communities that are directly affected by human trafficking and anti-trafficking. So when researchers talk to sex workers, when they talk to migrant workers and precarious migrants, over and over, there is growing evidence, there is overwhelming evidence that anti-trafficking measures overall seem to be increasing the criminalization, surveillance, and scrutiny of these communities rather than actually providing assistance. There is also growing concern that anti-trafficking is, or the issue, or there is concern that the issue of human trafficking is co-opted, or is often co-opted to further rationalize or justify restrictive immigration and labor migration policies. So if there is this danger out there, then the response is to crack down on migration or on particular labor industries. And so this report here, sorry for the cloudy, foggy image. So this is a report titled "The Use of Raids to Fight Trafficking in Persons." This is research done in the US, and it looks at the impact of the raid and rescue model, where law enforcement officers barge into a particular work sector to supposedly identify victims. But what has been found is that what tends to happen is that migrants or sex workers or migrant workers are often further traumatized by these very invasive law enforcement procedures. All right, so those are the concerns about the anti-trafficking industry, some overall concerns globally. If we turn now to Southeast Asia, so kind of starting to narrow down the focus. So the previous section looked at global concerns about anti-trafficking. So now I'd like to narrow the focus to Southeast Asia and ask, what can we learn from anti-trafficking research in Southeast Asia? And I would recommend this encyclopedia chapter that I recently published. Whoops, let me just move the bar here. Okay. All right, so this is a chapter, Anti-Trafficking in Southeast Asia, that that's recently come out in with the Oxford Research Encyclopedia on criminology and criminal justice. And so what I really tried to do in this chapter is I really tried to look at the anti-trafficking and human trafficking research in particular countries in Southeast Asia. And my objective was to try and pull out the most useful or valuable or current research on anti-trafficking that I thought scholars should know about. So my intended audience was students who are interested in working on this issue, activists or advocates or researchers who are perhaps engaging in this field for the first time. They're learning about anti-trafficking. So I thought my objective was, with all the anti-trafficking research that's out there, what are the most timely debates right now to be aware of? What is the most valuable research to start looking at? So my hope with the chapter was to give you a sample of the scholars, the researchers, and the research that is particularly relevant right now when it comes to particular countries. And so as just kind of one example, I want to talk about research by Kimberly K. Hoang. So Kimberly K. Hoang has done some very important research on anti-trafficking in Vietnam specifically. But some of the lessons from programs in Vietnam are applicable to Southeast Asia more generally and globally. And her research is particularly valuable because it looks at this fusion between victim protection and punishment. So, which is a characteristic of anti-trafficking initiatives, that even though there are programs and initiatives that are packaged, that are categorized as protection for victims, if we actually delve down into what those programs involve, these protective initiatives do seem to have quite punitive dimensions. And so Kimberly K. Hoang captures that very well in the Vietnamese context. So this is from one of her articles where she talks about diverting incarceration but trapped in an NGO. So this involves sex workers who have been captured or detained by police. So this is a scenario that she presents in the article. The police presented sex workers with two options. They could be marked as criminals and taken to a state-run rehabilitation center, or they could claim that they were victims of sex trafficking and be transferred to a local NGO where they would stay for several months while undergoing rehabilitation. When I asked the women if they felt like being in the NGO was better than the state-run rehabilitation centers, many complained that the NGO provided them with better food, but otherwise it was akin to being in jail. Their daily lives were structured by strict rules and routines. They were confined inside facilities with private guards who locked the doors and slept right outside at night to catch those who tried to escape. So she provides more concrete details about what rehabilitation involved for these supposed victims. So this is what sex worker rehabilitation through vocational training involved, organized by an NGO. So this involved working 10 hours a day, sewing clothes, wage deductions for mistakes with fabric. The products that rescued sex workers made were marketed abroad as fair trade products. Workers were paid $10 US per item, even though the items were sold at $100 US or higher for foreign buyers. And women did not receive their wages. So earnings were kept by the NGO director and sent directly to women's hometowns. And so actually, if you think back to the initial definition of human trafficking and what that involved, and you take a look at what this vocational training involves, you may see some disturbing similarities. Right, so that's one example. Her research was looked at programming in Vietnam, although when you look at the research in Southeast Asia and in other regions, what Kimberly K. Hoang finds here is not limited to Vietnam. Right, I'm just going to take a quick check the time and make sure it's okay. And please let me know if I should speed things up more. All right. So in the chapter that I showed a few slides ago, I took a look at various countries. So various countries in the region, or the research done on various countries in the region, are very useful for the global discussion on human trafficking and anti-trafficking. And so overall, one of the arguments that I make in the chapter is that anti-trafficking measures in Southeast Asia are marked by uneasy fusions and alliances between or among humanitarianism, market economies, law enforcement, and border control. So for example, I haven't listed the countries here, but when we're talking about the first bullet point, the first bullet point in particular refers to research done on Thailand, where it's very interesting to observe that even though there may be a lack of extensive evidence of human trafficking in particular areas, that has not prevented the fast expansion of the anti-trafficking industry. So when we're looking at the research on Thailand in particular, it's very interesting to analyze because the anti-trafficking industry seems to be growing and expanding, even if there isn't evidence of human trafficking to support that. And Elena Shi, another researcher who's doing fantastic work in this area, so she argues that there may be particular reasons why the anti-trafficking industry is expanding, even if there isn't extensive evidence of human trafficking in particular areas. The previous example that I spoke of speaks to the second bullet point here. So the fusion between humanitarianism and punishment in rehabilitation efforts for victims. So the need to really take a critical look at programming, to really look at, are victims being protected here, or are they experiencing other forms of control under the guise of protection? The research on Singapore is quite interesting because it relates to the third bullet point here, the interactions between different types of human trafficking. The research on Singapore has found this very interesting promotion, I guess one could say, of or public awareness building of sex trafficking. So there's a hypervisibility of sex trafficking as an issue. And this is a very interesting contrast to labor trafficking, which actually in reality may be much more extensive in Singapore, but doesn't receive the same amount of attention. So you have a great deal of attention on perhaps a relatively smaller issue, I guess you could say, or less prevalent issue, or a less prevalent form of trafficking, of sex trafficking, in comparison to labor trafficking, which may be much more extensive, but doesn't gain the same amount of public attention. And then in Indonesia, I'm happy to talk more about Indonesia in the Q&A because the research on anti-trafficking and human trafficking in Indonesia is very interesting. And I know I'm using that word a lot. So I would definitely encourage you to look at the chapter and to look at what research is mentioned in there. But I would say in terms of the trends in anti-trafficking and the impacts that it has for victims, one of the themes that comes up in the research is concerns competing understandings of human trafficking between different bodies, between different mechanisms, and how they clash or how they interact with each other in unexpected ways. I'll say a little bit more later on. And then in terms of the Philippines, the last bullet point here, the research from the Philippines has been very useful in looking at the use of gendered surveillance as a way to supposedly prevent human trafficking. And so this typically has involved greater surveillance of female travelers, greater surveillance of their morality or assumptions about their morality, their sexuality, and so on as they're traveling. Oops. All right. So in terms of Indonesia, I think one of the many very interesting facets of anti-trafficking involving Indonesians is the normalization or routinization of trafficking-related practices in routine labor recruitment or labor migration infrastructure. And this is something that Indonesian domestic workers in Hong Kong have been very active in dealing with. So this snapshot, this image here, is a story about Indonesian domestic worker-led organizations who organized events at HKU, at the University of Hong Kong, specifically about the criminalization of identification, including the falsification of travel documents by labor recruitment agencies for domestic workers. And so in Hong Kong, there was a time when domestic workers were bearing the brunt of this. So even though documents were being falsified by labor recruitment agencies, it was the domestic workers in Hong Kong that were being targeted by immigration officials in Hong Kong. And so when we consider the definition of human trafficking, and when we place that trafficking lens on the movement of domestic workers into Hong Kong and the typical labor migration infrastructure, one challenge is that when we're talking about trafficking practices, these are not distant or overtly criminal seeming enterprises that may come to mind. We are talking about routine business practices and how trafficking related practices have become embedded in those routine business practices in legal industries such as domestic work. Domestic work is a legal industry. It is a big industry in Hong Kong. And so this is something that I've written about with two co-authors, including Annie Listari, who is head of the International Migrants Alliance in Hong Kong. And so in this chapter here, which will be coming out next year, we argue that any anti-trafficking efforts will ultimately remain ornamental unless they address the lack of regular migration channels for precarious migrants and the routinization of deception, fraud, and exploitation in domestic labor recruitment. That's the challenge. So I would argue that if you want to do substantive work in anti-trafficking, if you want to make substantive progress in protecting victims of human trafficking, a convenient starting point or a productive starting point would be looking at legal industries such as domestic work. All right, so I have been talking a lot about, I've been very critical of the anti-trafficking industry because it has had very serious consequences for victims of human trafficking. But I did want to end on a more hopeful note. And I also wanted to talk about, what is the ethical approach to anti-trafficking? Human trafficking is an internationally recognized crime. It does occur. And so victims of human trafficking survivors do need assistance and protection. So then if there are many things that are wrong with the anti-trafficking industry right now, okay, so then how do we move forward? What is the ethical approach to anti-trafficking? I think one challenge in protecting victims is because the anti-trafficking framework currently is very much situated within the criminal justice system. And so this is something that you may have talked about and analyzed in your programs about the impact of the criminal justice framework and who it actually assists and who it doesn't. So that's one concern. So the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, they were looking at, okay, so what if we look beyond the criminal justice framework? What if we look outside of the criminal justice system to see how victims can be protected through other frameworks? And so in their report, they offered two important suggestions. So the first suggestion listed here is calling for an evidence-based approach. The data has shown that or to put it another way, there are a lot of concerns about anti-trafficking initiatives that may be based more on sensationalistic representations, such as the ones I showed earlier, rather than actual concrete information on who is trafficked, how, where, and why. As I said before, the representation of trafficking is very gendered. It's focusing exclusively on women. The realities are that men and women are trafficked, but that information is less visible. So the Global Alliance was calling for an evidence-based approach, basing initiatives and programming on what is actually happening to victims, to survivors. And then the second approach is calling for a rights-based approach. So earlier I mentioned that one concern with anti-trafficking programming is that it is very much focused on women's vulnerability rather than women's rights and men's rights in travel, in migration, and work. So in this report, Collateral Damage, there is a call to move towards a rights-based approach. Well, what needs to happen so that victims and survivors can exercise their rights? And so as it says here, one important recommendation is to base policies on evidence collected from trafficked persons and other migrants who have experienced abuse, and also from others who have firsthand experience of the counterproductive effects of anti-trafficking and anti-immigration measures. And I would say that I'll move ahead and then I'll go back. So this idea that, maybe in order to best help victims of human trafficking, we need to step outside the criminal justice framework. And we need to see whether other frameworks may be more effective in helping victims of human trafficking. So there are other frameworks out there that are being used to counter trafficking. So these include a sex worker rights framework, a migrant rights framework, and a labor rights framework. So you can see that they're all rights-based. And so as an example, Empower Foundation is a sex worker rights organization in Thailand that has produced some very important research on how sex workers have been victimized by anti-trafficking measures and what sex workers think is needed to help stop human trafficking. So Hit and Run is an important report that they've published about how victims have been further victimized by anti-trafficking programs. And this is Last Rescue in Siam is a short film that they've also produced that presents a funny caricature of victim protection from law enforcement in the sex industry. So I would definitely recommend those two resources. And so I'm coming close to the end now. The last example that I wanted to include, because it's a clear demonstration of how other frameworks outside of the criminal justice framework can be effective in helping victims. So this is an example based in Thailand, so I'll read it out. So this involves fighting trafficking with labor rights. MAP Foundation, an organization for migrant workers in Thailand, typically encounters one trafficking case per year and has found that migrant women have more agency in the process of taking grievances to court in the form of labor cases over trafficking cases. Trafficking cases take longer than labor cases, but more importantly than the length of time. In labor cases, the migrant makes the decisions of how far to take the case, which they cannot do in trafficking cases. In trafficking cases, it is often no longer a migrant's decision. Someone else makes decisions for the trafficked person. So the Migrant Assistance Program, MAP, makes sure that for every trafficking case, a labor case is also filed. And so with that, I'll end with some very useful resources that you may want to look at if you're interested in these issues. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the questions and conversations in the Q&A. And there's my email address and more information about my work if you're interested. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ham, for the very interesting lecture. I think you brought up so many points that I think for some of the participants here, it's the first time that they are hearing this. Before we continue, I would like to briefly recap some of the highlights from all the points that you just raised. In the beginning, you reiterated the international consensus of human rights, of human trafficking definition, which comprises of the act, the means, and the purpose that may happen in different contexts or industries. You also drew a connection between human trafficking, anti-trafficking, rescue industry, and then the implications there too. One interesting point that I think is new for some participants are the fact that sex worker rehabilitation through vocational training by NGOs is quite disturbing, actually, because if we look closely into how the training is constructed, it actually reflects some of the features of human trafficking itself. So that sort of contradicts with the purpose of why these NGOs actually exist. You also gave much emphasis on anti-trafficking in Southeast Asia, which you argued that it is marked by uneasy fusions between humanitarianism, law enforcement, border control, and also market economy. However, you also stated that anti-trafficking efforts would not be the lack of regular migration channels. And so the way forward to better approach anti-trafficking, which includes evidence-based and also rights-based. So now we will start with the Q&A session. We have received 2 questions conveyed in the chat column. For the first question, I'm going to take the liberty of recontextualizing the question to make it more relatable, if you may. So I guess the question is, there are many things that are being done to combat human trafficking, primarily through legal enforcement. However, legal enforcement itself is also prone to human rights issues or questions of human rights. For example, chemical castration to mitigate sex offenders, or to discourage sex traffickers, for example, or victims of human trafficking who are threatened by death penalty, in certain cases. And so, what is your take on that? And also, Dr. Ham, would you like me to convey both questions first before you respond, or would you like to respond one by one?
Yeah, I might as well get the questions together.
Okay, okay. For the second question, okay, so this is from Diantika Karin. She said, it is quite interesting point of view in anti-trafficking and gender, while here in Indonesia, the anti-trafficking movement still struggle in order to make the prevention and handling of trafficking in person to be more gender sensitive. Specifically from the Ministry of Women Empowerment, they are still working in the strategy of gender mainstreaming as one way to approach a more gender sensitive approach. As one way to approach more gender sensitive way in handling and preventing trafficking persons. What do you think would be the best strategy to balance the movement of anti-trafficking and gender mainstreaming, especially in the case of Indonesia? So I guess we can start with these two questions. Dr. Ham, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. In terms of the first question on law enforcement, so please correct me if I'm misinterpreting anything or going off on a tangent, but yes, I definitely agree that when it comes to law enforcement itself, some of the tactics and approaches in themselves are further harms and violations. And so in anti-trafficking, this is most prevalent in the raid and rescue model. Just write it down here. So this is a recognizable keyword for anyone who's interested. And so there definitely are strong concerns that in some ways the law enforcement done in the name of anti-trafficking is just replicating or entrenching the punitive surveillance that precarious migrants already face in various contexts, or that sex workers already face in various contexts. So it's part of the over-policing of marginalized communities, which is so that is definitely a strong concern. Which is very unfortunate, because when it comes to cases of human trafficking, when it comes to situations where, for example, a sex worker or a migrant worker is in need of assistance, there is a role for law enforcement. But my sense is that because there is this focus on surveillance, that there is a question of, does that mean that there's less attention paid to actual victims of human trafficking? So, for example, I'm thinking about my work with a sex worker support organization in Canada. And so by far, overwhelmingly, the women that the organization worked with, Swan Vancouver, most of the complaints were about law enforcement being invasive, being disrespectful, interfering with women's work. But in the rare cases that trafficking did occur, in the rare case that a woman actually was in a situation of some risk and needed assistance from law enforcement, it actually proved very difficult to get genuine assistance from law enforcement for actual cases. And this was something that the organization and I remember being very puzzled by, because I thought, well, if there's ever a time for assistance from law enforcement, it would be in an actual case of human trafficking. And so it was this question of, is it because there's so much attention and time paid to surveillance and interfering and trying to interfere with women's work that it distracts from the actual task of assisting victims when something actually does happen? So, yeah. And so that's my comment on the first question. But please let me know if I haven't addressed anything. And then in terms of gender mainstreaming. So I'm not familiar with where gender mainstreaming is in Indonesia, and it's something that you could probably educate me about. But I will say that generally overall, one approach or one strategy would be to maintain the focus on women's rights rather than women's vulnerability. So, and that also means the inclusion of women that may be marginalized from mainstream women's rights discourses. I'm not familiar with the Indonesian context, but I know, thinking of the Canadian context, thinking about the Hong Kong context, the mainstream or established women's rights sector sometimes can end up privileging or centering a particular class of women or particular groups of women. And so even though it's women's rights, in practice, there are various groups or communities that are left out. And so I would say when it comes to gender mainstreaming, another strategy could be to incorporate an intersectional approach in gender mainstreaming so that the inclusion of women's issues includes issues impacting low-income women or women from different regions or women from marginalized sectors such as sex workers. So paying attention to whether there's a particular group of women that is privileged in gender mainstreaming initiatives. So that, in addition to maintaining a focus on women's rights rather than women's vulnerabilities.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ham. But I would like to follow up on the last question, ma'am, if you may. You previously say that in terms of gender mainstreaming, we need to focus more on women's rights more than women vulnerability. And so I'm just wondering, what potentials would that offer? I mean, what is the difference between, the potentials of approaching gender mainstreaming from vulnerability and approaching it from women's rights standpoint? What difference would that make?
I think if we look at the lessons learned in the anti-trafficking industry, one concern has been that if the focus on vulnerability overshadows the focus on rights, that could eventually lead to the rationalization or the justification of further control of women. And so that has been found in anti-trafficking research, that if there is this view of women need protection because they're more vulnerable, if we take that argument further along, that can end up justifying programs like the Vietnamese program for sex workers, where women may not know what is best for them, so we will impose rehabilitation for them. We will impose a moral or occupational rehabilitation. It normalizes control of women's movements, and because there is this assumption that women wouldn't have the capacity to make those decisions on their own. I mean, so there on the one hand, so I agree that there needs to be recognition of how women may experience different vulnerabilities and risks and so on. So there are those realities. However, in dealing with those issues, I would argue that it would still be more productive to address or rectify those vulnerabilities through a rights-based lens, rather than a more vulnerability-based approach.
Okay. Dr. Ham, also responding to your previous answer of gender mainstreaming and how that is contextualized in Indonesia, I believe, Bu Iyi, would you like to have some time to respond to that, maybe to contextualize? Thank you.
Thank you, but Julie, I have to get a permission from you because I think I will explain it in bahasa Indonesia. Is it okay? Ya, teman-teman, mungkin saya ingin menegaskan apa yang disampaikan oleh Julie, karena memang menarik sekali ya, ada dua konteks ya. Ada pendekatan dalam penanganan kasus-kasus trafficking ya. Nah, ada pendekatan yang sifatnya meletakkan pada kerentanan dari korban, tapi ada juga pendekatan yang meletakkan hak korban. Nah, dua pendekatan ini memang pendekatan yang memiliki arah yang berbeda, ya, dan didasarkan pada dasar yang berbeda. Kalau yang pendekatannya kepada race dan vulnerability, kerentanan itu, bahwa perempuan rentan, tapi seringkali kerentanan itu dihubungkan dengan konstruksi gendernya, di mana perempuan memang lemah harus dilindungi. Sementara kalau yang berbasis pada hak-hak perempuan itu didasarkan pada perempuan lemah tapi dia perlu dilindungi, tapi dia juga memiliki hak untuk menentukan apa yang perlu dilakukan terhadap dirinya. Jadi hak perempuan untuk menentukan pilihan-pilihan termasuk jenis-jenis perlindungan yang dibutuhkan. Nah, ini gimana konteksnya dalam Indonesia? Misalnya pendekatan yang disebut oleh vulnerability itu akhirnya, yang kerentanan itu akhirnya masuknya pada pendekatan surveillance, kata Julie. Atau bahasanya lain adalah pendekatan yang lebih pada melihat, mengamati, mengontrol, yang sebetulnya sandarannya lebih kepada moralitas. Nah, ini yang menjadi penting. Nah, kontrol itu misalnya kalau dalam di Indonesia, itu jatuhnya pada upaya-upaya untuk di dalam satu titik imigrasi, ya, kontrol dalam imigrasi. Atau kalau di dalam, kan gini, ada perdagangan orang itu yang internal dan eksternal. Kalau yang internal itu di dalam negeri itu biasanya jatuhnya pada pekerja seks, ya, perempuan dalam prostitusi. Yang eksternal itu misalnya bisa menjadi pekerja migran, bisa juga menjadi pekerja seksual di tempat negara lain. Nah, di dalam negeri itu akhirnya program-program yang dibilang oleh Julie itu sebagai anti-trafficking industri, mereka yang dianggap di istilahnya ada pemeriksaan dan ditemukan ada para perempuan dalam prostitusi itu dimasukkan ke dalam dinas sosial, ya, di dalam dinas sosial, dan kemudian mereka dianggap pilihannya ada dua tadi ya, dia dianggap sebagai pekerja seks atau dianggap sebagai korban, yang sama-sama tidak enak dan tidak nyaman. Dan di dalam, kalau kita lihat di dalam rehabilitasi yang ada di dinas sosial di Indonesia pun tidak jauh yang dibilang oleh Julie Ham tadi, adalah program-program NGO. Nah, di Vietnam itu dilakukan oleh program-program NGO, tapi di Indonesia program-program itu dilakukan oleh pemerintah daerah dengan program-program pengentasan program-program pengentasan prostitusi, padahal sebetulnya banyak dari mereka adalah juga korban. Nah, satu lagi terkait yang di eksternal atau perdagangan orang yang eksternal yang menggunakan surveillance dan kontrol itu akhirnya adalah meletakkan mereka lagi sebagai pelanggar imigran. Jadi mereka adalah pelanggaran terhadap imigran karena penyeludupan manusia, dan kemudian di sana, di negara-negara itu mereka kemudian mengalami deportasi. Jadi tidak dilihat bahwa dia memiliki hak untuk bekerja, tapi karena dia adalah bekerja dalam konteks yang rentan, maka dia dikembalikan dan kemudian hak-hak kerjanya hilang. Nah, ini juga menjadi salah satu contoh perdebatan terkait dengan tadi risk and vulnerability dan juga dengan hak asasi manusia. Saya kira itu hanya menambahkan sedikit.
Ya, terima kasih Mbak Yi. Apologies, Dr. Ham. We were having difficulties with the translation process, and so Ms. Sriwiyanti was giving a little bit of a context to the participants in Bahasa Indonesia to reiterate what you previously discussed. Thank you again, Bu Iyi, for that context. We do have one more question, Dr. Ham, if I may read it out loud. The Indonesian government has been trying to prevent trafficking in persons through changes to legal products, improvements in procedures for sending migrant workers, and immigration selectivity control at the time of departure for the past 4 years, through the goal of protecting migrant workers as a whole. Since from departure to when working in Hong Kong, is there any impact on protection of Indonesian migrant workers in Hong Kong to date? Or is there any recent research in Hong Kong regarding this? And this is from Reza. Yeah.
All right, thank you for the question. My sense is that, or my perspective or opinion on that would be based on the information and knowledge that is produced by domestic worker-led organizations here in Hong Kong. So I think one strength or one thing to appreciate in Hong Kong is the strength of the migrant worker-led movement. And so they are quite active in producing analyses of labor migration issues. So in terms of research in Hong Kong, my suggestion would be to look into organizations such as the International Migrants Alliance, the Asian Migrants Coordinating Body, Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants. So they are producing very useful research. In terms of protecting migrant workers in Hong Kong, based on my conversations with Indonesian organizations here, I would say that one concern is that there is a sense that Indonesian workers are expected to bear the brunt of policies that they are not part of developing. So that particular policies or practices may be coming from the Indonesian government and likewise from the Hong Kong government that may actually make domestic workers more vulnerable, but that domestic workers are expected to deal with the consequences. So if it's a policy, for example, in the falsification of travel documents and the criminalization of identification documents in Hong Kong, for domestic workers who are following procedures from their agency and so on, in Hong Kong, there was a time when there were very valid fears that it was domestic workers themselves who were being detained, who were being imprisoned, who were being criminalized for actions taken by other parties. And so I would say that's one area where the domestic worker-led organizations have been very active in reducing. So if domestic workers are impacted by what other parties are doing, they shouldn't be the ones that end up being criminalized for that. So my impression is that it did lead to a reduction in domestic workers being detained or being arrested or being kept in detention and so on. So yeah, I would say, I mean, I'm not familiar with developments that are occurring in Indonesia, but by listening to domestic workers in Hong Kong, I would say there's still a lot to do. And a large part of that is about calling for accountability for what may be routine practices. So some of the harms and some of the violations that domestic workers are concerned about, they are embedded in typical agency practices. And so there is a real effort to call for both the Hong Kong government and the Indonesian government for greater accountability.
Okay, Dr. Ham, thank you so much for giving your response. We have another question from Oki this time. How is the consistency of law enforcement in Hong Kong in restricting the snakeheads, which has been operating in trafficking human, mostly women. The group operates in a similar way with Boryokudan in Japan.
To be honest, I haven't heard a lot about that. So one interesting trend or pattern in Hong Kong is that prior to the social movement in 2019 and prior to the pandemic and so on, so a few years back, there seemed to be a promotion of the anti-trafficking framework. So all of a sudden, like, anti-trafficking seemed to be being promoted as an issue in the media and so on. And as an anti-trafficking researcher, it was concerning because what I was starting to see in Hong Kong a few years back was the same thing that has been witnessed in Canada, in the West, in other countries where, okay, we're going to get this moral panic, we're going to get this public hysteria about traffickers and so on, which may not actually be based on evidence. So there seemed to be that kind of growing urgency or growing hysteria, even though I wasn't sure what evidence it was actually based on. But because of other priorities in Hong Kong, like the social movement and the pandemic, it's that anti-trafficking has really kind of gone down as an issue. It's really on the back burner. I would say that in Hong Kong, as in other countries, there tends to be, when trafficking comes up as an issue, there tends to be a great interest in either the sex industry or in criminal enterprises, very recognizably criminal enterprises. And what I've talked about in the chapter, particularly in the chapter that I've co-wrote with Annie Lestari, is that it's not necessarily these criminal enterprises, or it's not necessarily the sex industry that anti-traffickers should necessarily spend the bulk of their energy and efforts on. That if Hong Kong really wanted to do something serious, wanted to do something helpful about human trafficking, a good place to start would be the domestic work industry, and just how day-to-day how agencies do their work on a day-to-day basis. That would make my argument is that would make a huge impact if there was that willingness.
Yeah. I was just wondering, just to follow up to that question, why do you think much attention is actually averted to these enterprises rather than, addressing the root causes or something more closely linked to the issues such as domestic workers, like you said?
I think it's I think honestly part of it may be appealing in kind of a perverse way to the public. Like, if we think of traffickers as these very visibly and recognizably dangerous men preying on helpless women, that's a very cinematic narrative to grab onto. And it allows the public to distance themselves from issues of labor rights, of migrant rights, of sex worker rights. And so I think there's actually, it's in some ways that narrative, the typical anti-trafficking narrative of bad guys after, young girls, that's an easy narrative to sell and to commodify and to promote. It can be harder to actually talk to people about, well, why can't migrant workers have the right to stay in the country of destination? Why can't they have, greater rights and freedoms as migrants, as workers, or as sex workers? Why can't we decriminalize adult consensual sex work? So I think when we look at sex worker rights, migrant worker rights, migrant rights, we are talking about equality and equality of marginalized groups. And that can be harder for some people to or that can be more challenging for people to think about. So my sense is that the anti-trafficking narrative allows, it actually also allows a heroic narrative to play out, where then NGOs can be the saviors, or the rescue industry, they can come in and save the women. And there is actually growing research on the psychological appeal of this savior narrative or the heroic narrative, which obscures complicated realities.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I like how you I like how you fuse the answer with, the psychological perception of, the bad guys coming after the vulnerable guys. So that's very interesting for me. Yeah. We do have several more minutes before time is up. So if anyone would like to make, last comments or questions. Okay. I think this could be the last question, from Harfiana. To the extent of my knowledge, Hong Kong does not have a particular law which regulates human trafficking. I was wondering how the rights of the victims are actually regulated, and also what kind of protection may victims seek.
Those are good questions, for sure. I would say, let me just scroll back up. I would say that, to my knowledge, there are a few organizations that have that do with a very specific mandate. So we will assist trafficking survivors or trafficking victims. And my conversations with them is that one thing that makes it a challenge to help victims of human trafficking is that the anti-trafficking framework and conceptualization, it can sometimes restrict who you're able to help. So if you say, okay, we're only going to help victims of human trafficking, and if we think back to the definition at the beginning of the talk and the various components, all those various components means that you're talking about a very specific crime. And so for my sense is that organizations helping victims of human trafficking may be approached by many different kinds of migrants with different issues, different needs, who all need help, who all need genuine help. But that if they're going to stick with anti-trafficking, that means the percentage of people that they actually can help is quite narrow. And what that means is that other migrants or other individuals in need of help are excluded from assistance. So I think that's kind of one consequence of the anti-trafficking framework. And that may differ from, that may be in contrast to a domestic worker organization. So if a domestic worker-led organization provides assistance, they'll provide assistance to domestic workers in need. So whether they're trafficked or whether they just need help with their employer or whether they need help on this particular issue, so then assistance is more inclusive. Another challenge in assisting victims is conditionality of assistance. I don't know if this is the case in Hong Kong yet, but in other countries, it has been the case that assistance will only be provided to victims if they are willing to help with prosecution. So if they are willing to act as a witness or to assist in a criminal case, then they'll get assistance. If they don't agree to that, then they won't. And so with critical anti-trafficking organizations, they have been working to try and to separate the two. Just, victims should be provided assistance, whether or not they agree to assist with a particular case. So.
Okay, well, that's very quite interesting, Dr. Ham. There's actually one more question, and I hope the time suits it. Yeah. This is from Heidi. What steps should be taken to prevent the practice of trafficking in persons under the guise of becoming workers abroad, considering that Indonesian female migrant workers are vulnerable to being trafficked in human trafficking abroad? So I think maybe, aside from the things that you have pointed out early on, I think this question is asking for, some other ways or some other mechanisms that could be conducive to help prevent human trafficking.
So yes, so definitely overall, taking a look at how the labor migration infrastructure is actually run in practice. But I think also, if we're thinking about the Hong Kong context, I think there's also work that could be done with employers. So if we're talking about exploitation, which is part of the definition of human trafficking, there are certain things that are recognizably harms or violations, but that are actually not recognized as criminal offenses. So for example, in Hong Kong, like overwork, like excessive working hours for domestic workers is a real problem. Unsuitable accommodation or food. So there are things that are increasingly, encouragingly, they're recognized as harms or as things that need to be fixed, even if there's technically no law against them. And so this speaks to in part, this also speaks to employers' expectations, what they think is acceptable for domestic workers, or what they think will be tolerated in terms of employers' attitudes and how employers work with domestic workers. And I think one issue that has come up is that when workers experience exploitative or abusive environments, if they bring these back to their agency, there is a risk that the agency will say, "We'll just try to make the best of it, just try to get along, just try to stay there for several more months or till the end of your contract." So there seems to be a great reluctance to really deal with employers' violations or abuse. So I think part of that can be about looking into why certain things seem so normalized, or why certain things are tolerated or seen as acceptable when it comes to working with a domestic worker in your household.
Yeah. And I agree, Dr. Ham, because that's basically the essence of having a holistic approach to preventing trafficking, is that we look at different angles from different perspectives and see which parts that actually needs to be improved in order to prevent it from the root of trafficking. Yeah, I agree. I think we have reached the end of our guest lecture. On behalf of Bu Iyi and myself, I would like to convey our highest gratitude to Dr. Julie Ham for taking the time to give us a lecture and a very interesting discussion. I believe you have provided us with so many good insights from which we can learn a lot. I hope you also had fun and enjoyed your time with us this afternoon. Hopefully we could collaborate again in the future, Dr. Julie. Bu Iyi, do you have something to say? No? Okay. For the participants, thank you for joining us and for being active throughout the sessions. Hopefully you have absorbed so many knowledge as I did throughout this lecture. So that being said, I officially close this meeting. Thank you so much to everyone here. Okay.
Give a clap to Julie. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
so much for the invitation.
I hope that we can continue collaboration, Julie. I think it's a good idea to have a research together. I don't know how, but I
Yeah.
think we can support from the context of Indonesians and then and Hong Kong, and then I don't know, but let us thinking about it. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, yeah, Julie, and then yeah, thank you everybody. So everybody can leave the sessions, yeah, and then have a nice weekend, Julie.